Well, this session's a little different. I won't go through the introductions because you can all see them clearly there. You know, we've been talking a lot about strategy here, but we haven't actually talked to strategic planning itself. And this session is designed to sort of connect the dots between many of the previous sessions and how do we actually get to an integrated strategy that delivers the sorts of promises we heard about over lunch, for example, right? We've got a great panel to do that. Two members of the Congressional Defense Establishment, Dan Sullivan and Representative Smith. Representative Smith, of course, chairs the House Armed Services Committee. Dan sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee. I call him Dan because as young military officers, we traveled around together on the CENTCOM commander's airplane and learned at the desk, essentially, of our third member's father. So General John Abizaid was the CENTCOM commander. Dan and I were on General Abizaid's staff. Christy was at home at that time, but she's now in a major role in the U.S. government as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. So we've got a great panel to talk about this. You know, the last administration took I think, too little appreciated major step. Yeah. And that is that in the National Defense Strategy, they reprioritized the threats, right? And they moved the competition with China and Russia in front of the competition or the challenge of transnational terrorism, where terrorism had for about 20 years resided at the top of the threat hierarchy, right? So that was a major shift. And you know, to this day, I think there's pretty broad bipartisan consensus that China belongs there, right? And this is competition in all its realms, so economic, political, military, and so forth. But it seems to me the big news today, as we meet in the forum, is the war on Ukraine and what that means with regard to Russia's place in the priority of our national security strategy. So the first question I want to ask, and I'll pose first to the senator and then to the congressman, is are we at a strategic inflection point because of the war in Ukraine? As a former military officer, I think the last major strategic inflection point was 9/11, right? Now we're 20 years later. Is this a major strategic inflection point which should flavor our national security strategy and have implications that might run for a couple decades? So, Senator, let me pose that to you first, and then Congressman will come back to you.
Well, General, I think the answer is yes. And by the way, he calls me Dan. I call him General because I was a major when we served together, and he was a three-star general. So,
and now I call him Senator.
And I'm still calling him General. But look, I think you're raising a really important point, and there's strong bipartisan support for the Trump-era national security strategy, national defense strategy that in many ways the Biden administration, the Armed Services Committees have fully adopted it. The one issue I have with it is I think it needs a better definition. Right now when people talk about it, they talk about a return to great power competition. I actually think, particularly with the invasion of Ukraine, the better description is a return to an era that we've been in before of authoritarian aggression. That's more accurate. And I think that from our perspective, when you think about that, it's led by two dictators, Putin and Xi Jinping. They're increasingly isolated. When you read the intel, it's very dangerous. They're not getting a lot of advice from their senior officials. They are driven by historical grievances, and they are working together particularly to separate us from our allies. So to me, this new era is going to be with us for decades. And I think we have enormous strategic advantages relative to these two dictators, but we need to recognize what they are and be ready to face this era with confidence, strategic resolve, and a well-thought-out strategy that is bipartisan. In my view, Xi Jinping and Putin's worst nightmare is a long-term, serious, sustainable, bipartisan national security strategy. We're not there yet, but we're getting there. And it started with the shift during the Trump administration on the national security strategy, national defense strategy, pretty much adopted by the Biden administration, but we got a lot of more work to do on it.
Congressman, what's your take?
Yeah, yes is the obvious answer to the question. It's a major inflection point. Now, many would argue that you could have seen it coming for a while. The way I think about it is the post-Cold War era is officially over. We are now in the post-Cold War era. There are a number of people who argued that this was coming for a long time. I mean, Putin gave his speech at the security conference in 2007. I guess roughly translated, "We're coming for you," was sort of what he said. Xi has certainly been moving in that direction, but Ukraine drives home the point. We now face a major competition. And I like the senator's formulation. It is a competition against brutal autocracy. And we have got to form a global strategy to confront that. Now, I think it is kind of all interconnected. I think it's a mistake to try to separate it out and say we need to focus on China. No, we need to focus more on Russia. In fact, I had this regular joke that we needed a mnemonic device. It's China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and transnational terrorist groups. And actually, I had a staffer who came up with something. He called it the cringe, which is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and global extremism. And that's what we're up against.
Great. And every acronym has to actually be pronounceable.
Exactly. It takes some work. And the two key things to that are, one, the point that both of you have made. There has to be an overarching strategy to it. It can't be just, going out whatever the issue of the moment is. And I think the overarching strategy is clear. And, I know we're at the John McCain Forum, so sucking up to him seems like, what you got to do. But he was so right about this. And his global vision of the U.S. being the leader in moving the world in a direction towards greater peace and prosperity is exactly what we need right now. And the second thing beyond that is to figure out how we organize ourselves around it. And I will say one thing that worries me about conferences like this is we talk a lot about all the money we don't have. We need more money for this, we need more money for that, we need more money. Well, we got a lot of money, okay? $5 trillion. How are we spending it? Okay, what is the strategy, and particularly at the Pentagon, to update, and General Milley said it really well last night, warfare has changed, we got to change with it. Pentagon, Congress, Defense Industrial Base need to change radically so that we can build that coalition of the U.S., our partners, private sector, to meet the moment that Senator Sullivan just described.
This morning, Rich Clark, commander of SOCOM, I came up with a good phrase. He said that China and Russia together presented a dual peer nuclear threat for the first time, right? Because during the Cold War, we had a nuclear threat. I mean, that's the bilateral or bipolar nuclear threat. But I wonder if one of the things coming out of the war in Ukraine will be that our estimate of the Russian conventional threat and its ability to bully its neighbors won't be adjusted downward. Because after all, if the Ukrainians are winning, I think they are winning now, they've won phase one. If they continue on this path, I think the conventional capability of Russia will be exposed in a way that maybe resets this balance. Dan, what's your take on that? You think there's a potential for this?
Well, I think there's a potential, but I also think that, as General Clark mentioned this morning, it's also really important to recognize, again, Ukraine is one thing, and it was my view that the Pentagon has reacted way too slowly. I think General Milley has acknowledged that and is trying to really press what we have in terms of our ability to help actually win, how you define winning. They seem to be reluctant to say that, but I think that's important. But as General Clark mentioned this morning, the Chinese are watching this very closely, and the Chinese are taking lessons on the conventional failures right now as it relates to Ukraine. And I think that is really important to keep tabs and to keep very, very focused on that part of the world, whether it has ramifications for Taiwan, which I think it clearly does, but how the Chinese are viewing this in terms of their own conventional warfare capabilities. Remember, one of the many advantages I believe we have on our military capabilities, lethality, professional force, great leadership at the NCO, junior officer level, which we're seeing is exactly what the Russians don't have. But the Chinese haven't fought a war since, they had almost a draw with Vietnam 4 decades ago. Right. And so they're trying to learn from this as well, and I think we need to keep pace with that.
It'll be interesting to see if we get this intelligence assessment on China a little more close to right.
Yeah.
Right? We've had a tendency to make our enemies 10 feet tall over and over and over again. So it'll be interesting to see if we learn from our own sort of overestimation, perhaps, of Russian capability and apply that sort of dose of reality to the Chinese threat. So, Christine, we haven't talked about terrorism, but it's still on the list.
Yeah.
So could you just describe for all of us, in layman's terms, what is NCTC, okay? And how is it that you're sort of watching the back door on terrorism while the big guns are talking about China and Russia?
Yeah, so first of all, I'm still sitting with cringe. I'm thinking about whether to adopt either. Yeah, no, I mean, I'm whether I adopt the acronym or your staffer that came up with it. I think it's
that would
absolutely
make the
the way to go.
threat cringe-worthy.
There you go. There you go.
I'm sorry. All right.
Yeah.
All right. So,
No, yeah, exactly. That was pretty terrible.
it is after lunch, after all. That's it.
So first of all, as an American, as the leader of the National Counterterrorism Center, I couldn't be more pleased with the direction the country is headed in terms of taking head-on strategic competition, taking on the way that we approach in a deliberate way China, Russia, the various technological challenges, the grace-based challenges that exist within that great power competition. And I view our role in the CT community as fundamental enablers of our ability to do that. You know, you think about the CT dominance of the post-9/11 era and just how much we built and just how much success we have had against the extremist threat. And it is because of that success that we can do exactly what we're doing now, which is proactively, before the crisis hits, adjust the way that our national security strategy is prioritizing the major, sophisticated, complex threats that present challenges to the country like China and Russia do. To do that, though, we've got to do our job in the CT community better than we ever have. And it means that if we're in this time of deliberate adjustments of our national security strategy, shifting away in part from counterterrorism to these other national security priorities, let's give ourselves the time and the space to do it right. Let's manage that transition responsibly, and let's do it in a way where we preserve the best capability that we have built over the last 20 years in the CT community. Let's preserve those collaboration mechanisms like the National Counterterrorism Center represents for the CT community in a way that we can absorb the continued persistent threat that is the terrorism environment today. It's not that the terrorism environment has gone away. It's just that we have other challenges we have to deal with alongside it. And so how we do that responsibly, how we do that effectively means a deliberate, transparent conversation across our CT community, preserving the best capabilities that we have, and doing it in a way that allows those other agencies with responsibilities outside the CT realm to go and fight the good fight in that area. And so what I'm really proud about at the National Counterterrorism Center is that it exists as a melting pot for the counterterrorism community. We do homeland defense, we do international terrorism, we work on screening and vetting, we ensure that all of the country's counterterrorism information of note resides in one place and is exploitable in one place in a way that we can optimize our counterterrorism efforts in a way that is probably demanded today more than it ever has been. And so today is the moment for the CT community to come together to realize its collaborative, transparent roots, which is shocking for somebody in the IC to say, so that we can go and do other things as a country.
You know, as I look back at the last strategic inflection point, 9/11, right? We not only reshaped our strategy based on that tragedy, the crisis of 9/11, right? And applied resources in places they weren't applied before. But we also adapted organizations.
Absolutely.
So we created the Director of National Intelligence, of which NCTC is a part, right? We created Homeland Security. And now, 20 years into this, we face another, I think, strategic inflection point. It'll be interesting to see if we not only get the strategy right and apply the resources, as we've already discussed, but do we make some organizational changes that reflect these new challenges? I think we actually, as Americans, can be quite proud that we proved resilient and adaptive
Yep.
after 9/11. Now, it took us a while. Okay, we're 20 years later after all, right? But I think we're in a much better place, and we're much more secure against the transnational terrorist threat than we were on September 10th, 20 years ago. So that's actually a very sort of uplifting example of what's possible. You know, whenever we talk about strategy at the national level, typically we quickly move on to, well, allies and partners are going to be very important here, right? And the next question to the two congressmen, it has to do with how we cast that lens. So, Dan, you said, I think, democracy against aggressive authoritarianism, okay? Well, if we cast it like that,
Yeah.
and ask how are we doing against Ukraine, there's some interesting data. So 60% of the global GDP is on our side with regard to the sanctions regime and so forth against Ukraine. But only 18% of the global population. So as we cast the net to form a coalition against Ukraine, we got 60% of the global GDP, but only 18% of the global population. And there are some big fence sitters.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, China is beyond being on the fence, but India, for example,
Yeah.
much of the global south hasn't joined this coalition. So the question is, have we cast this too narrowly as you're with us or against us? Or have we cast it too much in black and white terms, democracy versus authoritarianism? And should we try to widen the lens and talk about perhaps those who believe in a rules-based order and those who want to disrupt it?
Well, look, I've had an opportunity to talk to a number of the allies, ambassadors from countries that you mentioned that are sitting on the fence. And I do think that they have reasons for it. You look at countries like India, you look at countries, Israel, on some of these UN resolutions. But I would say when we are looking at this new era of authoritarian aggression, that it's critical to continue to focus on our strategic advantages. And we have so many relative to the dictatorships that we are now, in my view, in a long-term competition with, particularly China. What are those? General, to your point, our network of global allies, to me, is probably one of the most important. And we are an ally-rich nation. We have been for decades because countries trust us. We're not perfect. But you look at our adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, they're all ally poor. Not a lot of countries clamoring to join the China and Russia team. So we need to continue to work on that. I actually think the Biden administration has done a very good job on working that angle in Europe and in Asia. Let me give you two others, though, where they in my view, need a course correction. To continue to focus on a lethal professional military force. You know, we had General Milley here last night. I have a lot of respect for General Milley, but he and Secretary Austin testified in front of the Armed Services Committee just 3 weeks ago, and I pressed them on, hey, you're saying this is the most dangerous time in 50 years. Why are you coming forward to this committee with a budget cut to our Defense Department? It's 4% increase with 8% inflation is an inflation-adjusted cut to the Department of Defense. Last year, President Biden did the same. Working with the chairman here, you had a bipartisan rebuke of that cut to our defense departments. And in the NDAA, we put forward significant real increases to the budget. We need to do that. It is a dangerous area. And I'll give you one final one. Might be a little controversial. Bill Cassidy talked about it a lot this morning. But on energy, I was in a meeting, one of the most memorable meetings I've had with the man that we honor here, Senator McCain, and Vladimir Kara-Murza. It was at the Halifax Forum. By the way, one of the great leadership traits of John McCain was that whether you wanted it or not, there's so many senators here right now who were who John McCain mentored. So many, pretty much everybody. I had the honor of being one of them. It really wasn't a choice, by the way. If he had chose you to be he was going to mentor you, then goddamn it, you were going to the Halifax Forum, Munich Security Conference, Vietnam, Shangri-La Dialogue, I'll just give you one final aside on that. One year I couldn't go to the Shangri-La dialogue. I had a really good reason. John McCain sat down next to me in my seat in the Senate, looked at me, Dan. No, he actually called me Danny. Only senator called me Danny. Danny, why aren't you going to the goddamn Shangri-La dialogue with me right now? You and I always go there. John, my middle daughter is graduating from high school that weekend. He pauses for a long couple seconds, and he looks at me. Look, she won't care if you don't go to her. You know the energy of the man, right? So anyways, sorry, I digress, but it's a good story because you all get what I'm saying. So anyways, we're sitting at the Halifax with Vladimir, who we all know we honored last night and is now in a Russian jail. And I asked him at the end of our 3-person meeting, what is the number one thing we can do to undermine the Putin regime? Number one thing. And he looked at me, Senator, it's easy. He said, produce more American energy. Number one. And this administration from day one has decided to do the opposite. And that's not good for our allies, not good for our country. It's not good for the environment, in my view. Bill Cassidy talked about natural gas in America, export around the world, dramatically reduces emissions. So we need to focus on our strategic advantages. The most important one, I think, is what we talk about here all the time at this forum, and that's our democratic values. And we need to remember that. Putin and Xi Jinping fear their own people. They fear their own people. That is a strategic advantage we have over there that we should be taking advantage of for years and decades to come. But to me, that's what we got to do. Huge strategic advantages we have. We got to recognize them, be confident in them, then employ them for, in my view, decades to come.
So a lot to cover here. I think back to your original question as to what's the frame.
Right.
We're just developing that frame, and it's really important how we develop it. I think it would be a mistake to do the, we're the white hat trying to save the world. Our values are better than yours. We're perfect. Follow us, and everything will be fine. I think we've done that before, and it hurts us. Right. I think we should talk about economic and political freedom. There are a lot of countries in the world that we're going to want to work with who don't live up to that. So I think the better frame is global order. It's the idea that we have a rules-based international system. And we're all working towards the best possible point. None of us are there perfectly. So I think we have to be really careful about trying to do the old West, you're either with us or you're against us thing. Because the world right now sees the US through a much different lens than we see it. They see those warts that we talk about with a lot greater clarity. And we have to be honest about that as we work with them. You see that in India. India's like, okay, well, you say Russia's bad, but are you really any better? All right, and they've got some history on that, our relationship with Pakistan, a whole bunch of other things. So I think there has to be a certain humility in how we approach this, with the central premise being rules-based international order. It's better for us, but it's better for you too. It's a cooperative agreement. And then we have to figure out how to pull all of that together while respecting the different strengths that different partners have. I was just on a trip to Australia and India. Both are great partners in different ways. Diplomacy is going to be so crucial in terms of how we pull that together. So that's one big point. We have to be really kind of humble about this message. Understand that a lot of the reason that the rest of the world pushes us away is nobody likes the person who's always telling you how great they are, okay? Even if they are great. In fact, especially if they are great, it makes it even more annoying, all right? You want to try to work with people to pull them together in terms of how we do this. The other big thing that we need to focus on, this from a little earlier, is deterrence. And what does that mean, okay? What does it mean? We've talked a lot about the calculations that China's doing right now. And they are absolutely looking at Russia, going, maybe this isn't as easy as we thought it was. And that's good. We have to exploit that. But we have to build the military, and go back to Chairman Milley's remarks from last night. We'd all like to fight the first Gulf War over again because it worked so well for us, and that's terrific. But it's about missiles, information, and drones now. Are we building enough of those? When China looks across the strait, what is going to deter them? And one of the most instructive things that's come up in the Armed Services Committee the Office of Net Assessment did a whole bunch of war games against China. And the general feeling, which is what we always get in the defense establishment, is we're losing. They're better than us. They're not 10 feet tall. They're 60 feet tall. Oh my God, there's nothing we can do. We're going to get killed. There's a lot we can do, first of all. China has a bunch of weaknesses. We have a bunch of strengths. We should be aware of that. But then the Air Force said, well, let's do a war game, and let's imagine if we had some of these capabilities that we want to have. And the most fascinating part of that is the Red Team commander looked at that battlefield and said, I'm not going to fight. I'm not going in. Of course, the people running it said, well, that's cute, but we're actually doing an exercise, so you have to go in.
We have 2 more days here.
But that's what we want, is we want Xi and China to look at the battlefield and go, no. And that's where we have to be really smart about how we deter. Now, I do have to make 2 points that I don't entirely agree with the senator on. Obsessing about how much money we spend at DOD drives me insane, okay? It's $770 billion, all right? It's going to be maybe 800, maybe it'll be 820. It's going to be a hell of a lot. Are we spending it well? The Pentagon is still stuck in process. They are still stuck in requirements. They are not innovative. There's a great article in Foreign Policy magazine talking about how we are still running the Pentagon like it's the Ford Motor Company in 1955 instead of Apple in 2021. We don't encourage innovation. We don't encourage problem solving. We don't reward people for taking risks. You know, I would freeze the frickin' defense budget and go in there and fix the way they do that, and we'd be a hell of a lot further along. A VC friend of mine once said that he hasn't met the entity that can't be cut by 10% and get better at what it does. I told that to Secretary Austin, and I thought he was going to have a stroke. He was not fond of that formulation. I'm not suggesting that, okay? But let's stop talking about, oh, it's 5%, it's got to be 10, it's got to be 15. Spend the money better. And I will also simply make the point that as we sit here today, the United States of America is producing more energy, drilling more gas, more oil than we have at any point in our history. What we need to do is we need to develop those alternatives so that when we come rolling up to the pump and it's $5 a gallon, we don't say, hey, let's go drill someplace else. We say, you know what, we're just going to charge our car over here. We're not going to have to buy the gas. If we have that alternative, we make the investments there and have an alternative to fossil fuels, that's how we get off of our dependency on places like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela.
You know, this is really interesting. Yeah, please,
Doug,
Christine.
can I just make one quick point, which is just a quick example of where your question on partnerships and China, Russia, and the CT world all come together, and that is in the threat that is growing in Africa, the geostrategic politics that are going to be at play in Africa, and the degree to which the partnerships that we've built, largely because of the CT landscape that we've seen develop over years, is going to be fundamental to our ability to kind of maneuver in the strategic competition space with a lot more alacrity than we could have otherwise had we not built on that foundation. So you look at, you know, the number of flights going from Beijing into parts of Africa. You look at the deployment of Wagner across large swaths of, especially North Africa. You look at the rising degree of extremism, of terrorism, of insurgency that's happening across, especially North Africa, especially in East Africa. And all of this is going to play out together. And if we're not strategic about how we bring all of the tools and all the different components of our strategy together, then we're missing a huge opportunity.
So, and if I can, General, real quick, the Congressman and I, the Chairman and I agree on a lot. We work together on a lot of things. But just a couple points for clarification.
I tried, guys. I tried.
Good discussion.
It's a bipartisan panel.
I tried to move us on.
Hey, you know, John McCain would want this to be a little spicy, let's face it, right? Pressing democratic values is not bragging how great you are. Pressing democratic values is one of the big things that helped us win the Cold War, right? So I think that's very important, and I'm not saying you said that.
Yeah, no,
you kind of implied.
I did not imply it at all.
So let me make two other points
that we should be humble about, and it is not spreading democracy. There's a whole lot of other things that had nothing to do with spreading democracy that the rest of the world has noticed. That is what we need to address, not spreading.
Well, I'm just making a clarifying point, which is an important one. Yeah. The process side that Chairman Smith is making with regard to the Pentagon, I couldn't agree more. And I think, for example, our acquisition programs are completely broken. we need full-fledged overhaul. However, when you look at a budget that's put forward, which this one is, which is shrinking the Navy pretty significantly, shrinking the Air Force pretty significantly, these are exactly the kind of things that, in my view, make the dictators, Xi Jinping, Putin, pleased. So it's a combination, I think, of both of what we're talking about, and I think that that's an important point that we can both work on. Yes, there's a lot we can do with regard to processes in the Pentagon that is backwards, that needs a lot of help in terms of reform, but capability does come with dollars, and this budget that is put forward is shrinking capability, and that's a problem in these times.
Let me just come back. This question of values really strikes a chord with me, too. So as a former NATO ambassador, I'm reminded that the second sentence of the NATO treaty, so this is Harry Truman, 1949, original 12 allies, right? The second sentence says that all the signatories to the NATO treaty will adhere to the three core values of the alliance: democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law. Right? So at least in terms of those who sign up for these values, we should be pretty strict in expecting those values. And back to the chairman's point, we need to do this as Americans with a little humility. How are we doing on democracy, individual liberty, and rule of law? And a little humility goes a long way here in terms of the shining light on the hill. And I think we can all agree on that. Now,
yeah, and Mark Esper and I were talking last night, and
right.
when he was asked what's the greatest threat to U.S. interests, and he gave the greatest threat to U.S. interests is the flaws in our own political systems right now, is the conflict that we have in the country about showing people that democracy can work.
Right.
So fixing that, sends a much better message.
Democracy's got to deliver, right?
Yeah.
Or it doesn't matter what your strategy is. Let me just go to one quick process point. We're closing in on the last 5 minutes here. The way our system's designed, a new administration is required by law to produce a national security strategy in the first year, right? And then it cascades from there. Then the Defense Department produces a national defense strategy, the NDS. Then the military, a national military strategy, and so forth. And this year we actually have a fourth leg of this process because NATO is updating its fundamental strategic document, the strategic concept, right? But it seems to me we're out of cycle here, right? We have an interim national security strategy. We don't have the real thing, right? We have a draft national defense strategy, which has probably been shared with both of our armed services committees, right? And we're about to begin to have a debate over resources before we have the strategy right. And even if we had a national security strategy, it's not one that integrates conversations like the lunch topic, food security. It's not one that adequately integrates energy security. So we talk about strategy as though we all understand what everybody else is talking about. But frankly, I think the last half day here at the forum, for me, has reminded me that strategy is a much bigger thing than the military. So could I just get all three of your reflections on that?
I would just say, and maybe at least my kind of closing thoughts would be one of optimism. As I mentioned, the national security strategy and national defense strategy of the Trump administration was this reorientation to great power competition. And it was public, and the national security strategy was published 2017. Then to your point, General, the national defense strategy followed up in 2018. And the good news is it's quite bipartisan, right? You look at the NDAAs, you look at where the national security strategy on both Democrats and Republicans has reoriented. It's reoriented in that direction. And I think that's really positive, and I think that's really strong. And as I mentioned, Xi Jinping and Putin's worst nightmare is a combined long-term bipartisan strategy. To your point, I would agree with what you're saying right now. Just 2 days ago, the Deputy Secretary of Defense briefed the Armed Services Committee on the new National Defense Strategy. I read it. She briefed it. It was all classified. And the first question I asked her, because I'd read it, I said, I've read this document. None of it needs to be classified. Like, why are we in a classified setting? If we're going to incorporate all these other instruments of power, let's bring this document out into the open so the American people can see it. I think they're going to do that soon, but to me, having the whole thing under this classified setting is very counterproductive to make for an informed, fully integrated strategy with all the instruments of American power that we need.
And to get the resources lined up properly,
Correct.
right? Christy, what are your thoughts?
I mean, I'll just pick up on your point about communicating it, right? I mean, you know, we've got lots of people that exist in the national security world to do strategy, to do the integration, to work through what the implementation plan of any given strategy is. One of the things I think we do really poorly in the national security world is talk about it to the American public in a way that they value it as part of what is going to make this country safer, more secure, and better positioned to lead the world. And so to the degree, and you know, I say this as somebody who was started my career in the intelligence community, is now leading a center that is part of the intelligence community. I think the intelligence community is a really poor offender of this same thing. We have a lot of knowledge, a lot of value. We have a lot that we need to be able to communicate to the American public about what's important about those strategy elements that are going to establish us as the leader of the rules-based international order. And if we're not better about communicating it and making the case publicly, then we're not going to win the argument at home, which is where it matters most first.
Yeah, I mean, amen to both of those points. I think we should make that more public. And I think one of the great lessons, everyone talks about how the fact that we made the intel on what Russia was doing in Ukraine was such a big win. I think we tend to be stuck in the world of like 50 years ago when information was hard to come by. And if you had it, you wanted to protect it. I mean, information is pretty much ubiquitous now. It's not that we don't have some classified secrets here and there, but by and large, it's out there. I think we have to be more forward-leaning on that, without question, in terms of how we approach it. But to the larger point of the strategy, the one thing I always worry, people tend to say, well, we don't have a plan for this, we don't have a plan for that. There's no perfect way to anticipate everything that's going to happen in the world. I think we need to be a little more positive about the fact we do have a lot of strategies and a lot of plans. We have conferences like this and many others that are integrating. I'm the co-chair of the Caucus for Effective Foreign Assistance, even while I'm the chair of the Armed Services Committee. There is a lot of integration going on. Is it perfect? No. I mean, it's a massive world with a massive number of problems. But I do agree with Dan that I think there is a growing consensus. Ukraine has certainly helped focus that, bipartisan, bicameral, across the country, to form that strategy. But I'll just close with the point we were making about how important it is to show our values to the world. I think the values of economic and political freedom are great, as you pointed out quite well. They're not always easy to live up to. And instead of being sort of this moral scold on the world stage, telling everybody else how they have to live up to our standards, I think we need to be a little bit more understanding about the challenge and then focus back home. And look, the January 6th Commission, and I don't know if Adam Kinzinger is still here, I think that is really, really important, okay? To point out, we are going to respect the rule of law at home so that we can then have more credibility internationally to say, we need you to respect the rule of law. Because every country is dealing with all of these different problems. We have to respect our democratic institutions, and we have to respect the outcome of elections, even when we lose, okay? That's sort of the cornerstone of democracy, the peaceful resolution of our differences. Not, well, I'll follow these rules, but if I lose, all bets are off, and I'm gonna do everything I can to win. We gotta start delivering that message in cooperation with the world.
That's a good place to thank the panel, and please join me. Nice job.